Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at a book that was requested by my patrons over on Patreon, and that is Gradient Descent. So this is an adventure for the Mothership sci-fi horror role-playing game. What's interesting about this book is that it has a lot of really remarkable design features in that it crams a sci-fi Megadungeon where you're exploring a huge haunted space station into just 64 pages. So there's some interesting features on how that is pulled off while keeping the design easy to read and very cool looking. Today's video is sponsored by Into the AM and their new t-shirt club subscription service. In the t-shirt club, you get a brand new t-shirt every single month from their wide variety of designs, which cover everything from sci-fi to horror to fantasy. You're gonna find stuff that matches Mothership or fantasy role-playing games, or the wide variety of stuff that I look at here on the channel. If you use my code QuestingBeast at checkout, you can get the whole first month free. That's a whole t-shirt for free right there. Click that link in the description below to check it out for yourself, and thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring. Let's get back to the show. All right, let's take a look at what we get inside Gradient Descent. So here's our back cover right here. It's a random search table. As usual, this features a lot of the design work that we've seen on a lot of Mothership products, which is very dense. It makes use of every single inch of the book, front and back, inside covers included. We have a lot of artifacts here in the back cover that you can discover on this space station. And the inside front cover is a general map of the whole Megadungeon. It's designed in a really interesting way. It looks a lot like an electronics diagram. So it's abstracted more than you typically see for Megadungeons. You don't see exactly how long the connections are or the exact size of each room. A lot of abstraction has had to be done here just to fit something so complex into a relatively short book. But it is quite easy to use, especially since you don't really worry about those distances as much. One thing that you should note here is that all of the rooms have a room number, but rather than that just denoting a particular room, that's actually referring to the page number. It took me a little while to figure out, but it's a really great feature. Basically, it's the same feature that I used when I created The Waking of Willoughby Hall, which is a haunted mansion adventure that I did. This makes looking up the room really fast. Because if you go to this room, you just go to room 35, then you look for number D on that page, and there it is. Each of these sections or these floors of the space station has its own spread within the book where all of these are blown up with more detail. I should point out that all of the writing is done by Luke Gearing, editing and development done by Jarrett Crater, and proofreading by Jared Sinclair. All of the illustrations are done by Nick Tofani, and the layout and design, which probably was an enormous amount of work, is all done by Sean McCoy, who created the Mothership franchise. Over down in this corner, we have a summary of how encounter checks work, and here is a key for interpreting some of the diagrams we have on the page. Brain scans are a really big part of this. You're exploring this haunted space station where this malevolent AI is working on its own inscrutable plans, and a lot of what it's doing is it's creating androids. This was originally a facility for building androids. And so what it does is it scans your brain all the time. There's a lot of different features throughout the dungeon where your brain can get scanned. And if that happens, it can start putting it into androids and creating replicas of you to really mess with your head. There's a whole new attribute that you get in this adventure called the bends. The whole dungeon is called the deep, so it's kind of a diving underwater analogy. And as you get deeper and deeper into this thing and weirder stuff's happening, you start doubting your own humanity. You start wondering whether you are in fact an android. Because this AI has the ability to make androids with fake memories, eventually you become uncertain whether you are an android yourself. We have a spread here looking at how the book works, including how these diagrams operate. If a room has a thin border like this one, then it's a human scale room, something like this. But with a dark border or a thick border, it's an industrial scale room. That's these massive superstructures that can take half an hour to cross. Really the vibe that a lot of this book gives off is something like in the manga Blame or in the short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. These massive superstructures that are built on scales that are not designed for humans, that you're slowly crawling through, trying to avoid the gaze of these horrible machines that hate you. We have a page here on Monarch, which is the AI and its motivations and how it acts, and its panic table right here. You do run it like an actual person. Mothership has rules for building up stress and panic, and the AI has that as well. If the players are going through the deep and are really messing with stuff and interfering with the plans and possibly causing a danger to Monarch, it's going to get more and more panicked and throw greater and greater resources at you until the point where you're just overwhelmed with hundreds of androids coming to kill you. So you have to be very careful with how you act. A page on the Benz effect and the psychological effect that it can have on players as they become more and more warped by the psychological pressure of being in this place. And a look at Cloudbank, which is the original name of this space station, and its android program. It's building infiltrator androids, which are androids that replicate a particular person, and it's been sneaking these all over the galaxy, infiltrating major organizations and political parties, ready to seize control of the galaxy at a moment's notice, and no one knows it. But there's also security androids, which are just more obviously android-like creatures roaming the facility that can be a danger to you. You can also encounter ghosts. So these are brain scans that Monarch has taken that have kind of taken on a life of their own and occupied holographic emitters and are wandering around. So they still think that they're people or something like a person, but they're now erratic and slightly insane. You're going to have to deal with that. They can be provoked by different things. You can try and soothe them. They have a particular trauma that they try and impart upon you. And a page on Fallout for what can happen at the end of this adventure, the long-term effects that can ripple across the galaxy. And there's a whole bunch of them. This is definitely an OSR game in the sense that it is very committed to player freedom and playing out the ramifications of the player's choices, as crazy as those can be. We have a section here on the Blockade, which is a group of ships that have been hired to defend the deep, or defend isn't the right word. It's mostly there to keep people out. They know that the AI has gone rogue here and that it's a danger to the galaxy, so they want to isolate it as much as possible. There's even teams of troubleshooters that eventually or occasionally go to the space station and try and weed out divers, which are explorers going through the dungeon. However, it is possible to bribe your way in if you have enough money, and possibly make an ally of one of the troubleshooter commanders who has been turned and now believes that the AI must be destroyed. The Bell is a little space station that's orbiting the deep, and you can use it as a kind of base of operations from which to launch exploration parties from. There's a couple of NPCs here. Arkady, the first diver, who's this old, washed up, grizzled Russian guy who will give you lots of advice about what's going on in there. And Noriko, who's the witness of something great and terrible, and she's kind of like a religious zealot who can also give you information. There's also a cyborg in there who we'll talk to as well. This is really a place to give the players lots of information. So depending on the different topic that they want to explore, the different colors represent the different NPCs and what they will tell you. And it's going to vary based on the different person. They're going to have different information. But this is not the sort of game where you're going in blind. It is definitely incentivizing the game master to tell the players lots of stuff so they really want to go in there and they have something to act on. They're not just going in blind. A lot of stuff in the dungeon is extremely dangerous, and you don't want them to just be tripping stuff and rocks fall and everyone dies. They should know the consequences of their actions, or at least know what the stakes are. And that's what this is all about setting. We have our first room diagram here of this little space station, the Bell, and the layout for describing the rooms is really good. It's pretty close to ideal. It's very similar to what I use in my own stuff, where you have a bold for the actual name of the room. You have 18A, right? This is actually page 18, and that is the first room, so it's called 18A. You have bullet points going to the most important stuff. If something is red, then it's often something really important that you should pay attention to, often something dangerous. Here is just the NPCs. And if there's something that you can learn by looking closer and getting into more detail, there'll be like a little sub bullet point there where you can get even more information. So just by scanning these short little paragraphs, you can get a very clear sense of the room. Now, one thing that we're going to see as we go through this adventure is that it's very dense and it's been very compacted to fit into a smaller space. Typically, this works quite well. It gives you most of the stuff that you need, but there are situations where things are a little bit abstract and not really fleshed out and rely more on the game master to add more detail. And so that's going to depend on you whether you're into that or not. There are some rooms where I was really wanting more detail, but I think it just didn't fit into the book. We have a page here describing the different layers of the deep, the different floors and what you find on them. However, I think I actually found this little diagram right here near the beginning a little bit easier to read and understand. But this one is in 3D, so you can see a bit more the spatial relationships. Our first section is reception and habitation. So this is an area that is all human scale, except for this big visitor's dock right here. And as I mentioned before, the layout's very good. It's very easy to scan each of these rooms. The red stuff is typically dangerous stuff that's going to pop out at you. So as a game master, you need to be aware of it. The room diagrams take a little bit of time to get used to, especially as they get more complex, but really it's pretty good, especially since the actual names of each rooms are kept in there as well. So if the players go straight to that room, you can at least tell them it's a cafeteria before you jump to the actual entry and read that. The encounter tables are written right on the map. So at the visitor's dock, we have the possible ships that are docked there and encounters that you can have while wandering through this area. This area, Eden, is part of a social experiment being run by Monarch, where it elevates certain androids up to a chosen status and it lets them live in paradise, whereas ones that it doesn't like are relegated to the fallen. They live in these horrible conditions and they're often looted for parts by the chosen, and they hate the chosen and they're in this conflict. So there's two different factions here. There's not a lot of combat in this area. It definitely incentivizes the game master to do a lot of role-playing opportunities, because despite being this nightmare sci-fi mega dungeon, there's a lot of characters and a lot of entities that want to talk. They need things, and you can get by them by being a good negotiator, which is a really great feature to have in any mega dungeon. The section that is in light green over here is actually an area that is not described on this page, but is on the next page. So just by seeing the color, you know whether it's on this spread or the next spread, which is a nice feature. And now we get into the area where the fallen are hanging out, including the labyrinth, which is a literal labyrinth made of this sort of synthetic, fleshy material. It's nice and horrible, in the center of which is the Minotaur. The Minotaur is the child of Monarch, but instead of being this perfect weapon against humanity, it has decided that it loves humanity and wants to help them. So it's this really powerful NPC that could be a huge benefit to humanity if it got out. It looks horrible right now, but it can change its shape. So once it's outside of the space station, it can take a more pleasant form. It is one of those features that I wish I just had more information about. It doesn't really have a description of what it looks like. It just says it's horrible looking, and there's a picture here, which of course you can use. I would have liked more details to give to players and more information on, is it actually helpful to humanity? In what way is it helpful? How will it lead humanity on a better course? Or is this part of an elaborate deception? A lot of that is just left up to you. Floor 3 is by far the biggest floor in the Mega Dungeon, and it is divided into, I think, 7 different parts. These are all the different sections that are building the androids. And most of them are these huge rooms full of machinery that is way above human scale, and you're gonna have to try and float your way through it because most of them are in zero gravity. All of the environments are very well jaqued, which means that there's lots of different ways to get around. There's a lot of loops. If there's any one particular location you want to get to, there's usually more than one way that you can reach that. It's going to depend on how well you've explored and how much risk that you're going to take. Because usually one path there is more dangerous than another. There's lots of opportunities for role-playing, as I said before. For example, there's cryopods here where you can unthaw any number of interesting people that you can interact with, who can help you or harm you in some way, depending on how you deal with that. There's plenty of great nightmarish imagery all throughout this, as befits a horror sci-fi game. For example, you can discover the reject bin, where you find the sound of 1,000 screaming damaged voices over a colossal mountain of twitching broken bodies. So this is where all of the reject androids are thrown. But you also run into certain situations where, for example, this is a zero gravity room. So how do you have a giant mountain of bodies? And how do you have this giant claw that goes down and grabs them and drags them out somewhere else? They should be all floating in a cloud if it's zero gravity. There's a couple situations like that where I feel like the author forgot that it was zero gravity. And so you have like this visualization of a really freaky scene, which I like quite a lot. But it doesn't fit with the environment in the way that it's described. Of course, you could tweak that for yourself, but just keep an eye out for stuff like that. The next part of part 3 is the skeleton works, where they make all of the skeletons and bones for the androids. Lots of freaky imagery to be found there. We have the Pseudoflesh Farms, which is run by its own little mini AI called Silas, who it recommends that you run with a British accent that you can interact with. You can't actually meet him because he's just an AI, but his voice keeps coming through all of these speakers that you find in all of these fleshy rooms. And if you pull out the speaker, you can find that it's connected to an actual throat with like vocal cords. So that's nice and horrible. There's a brain construction area where you're going to find things like the Mind Thief, who is a android that has escaped and actually has a plan to take out Monarch with a virus that it has, but it can't get too close to the main data core that Monarch runs off of. So if you manage to find this character, you can actually take out the AI itself, although it's not going to be easy. There's lots of different rooms that play on particular fears. For example, this room is just called the Void. It's a massive, completely empty, perfectly black room. And as I said before, most of these rooms are in zero gravity. So if you just launch yourself out into this without paying attention, you'll just find yourself floating through a black void. We have disassembly rooms where the androids are finally put together and or ripped to pieces if they do not pass quality control. Storage rooms where you can find thousands and thousands, let's see, 100,000 finished androids, all of which are ready for Monarch to activate to use against you or for its nefarious purposes around the galaxy. We have quality assurance, which includes things like a spider tank, a bit of a reference there to Ghost in the Shell, which at higher security levels can start rampaging throughout the whole facility, ripping through doors and trying to get at you. There is a full-on nuclear warhead in this floor that you can discover and reactivate if you're really good at hacking, or if you follow the instructions of a ghost who is also there and who really wants to take out Monarch. If you're lucky, you could probably come up with a plan to take out Monarch with the nuke, although it might be a suicide mission. Although given the threat that Monarch poses to the galaxy, it might be worth it. Floor 4 is just called Hell, which stands for the Human Emulation Labs. Here you have thousands and thousands of AI robot children who are competing against each other in tons of different tasks to try and emulate perfect humans. And the ones that fail get their minds wiped and then new personalities implanted, and they're forced to do it over and over again. So it looks like this has been going on for at least 8 Google generations. It does recommend, though, that if child androids make your crew uncomfortable, you can always switch them out for adult androids. That's only marginally less uncomfortable. Floor 5 is the AI core itself, where you can confront Monarch. However, by the time you get here, Monarch will probably be in full panic mode and be throwing every resource that it has against you. So you better have some serious firepower or a great way to hold it hostage. Floor 6 is engineering and support, which has a lot of rooms marked with these little spider web icons, in which case you will find little steel filaments all throughout those rooms. And if you snap one of those filaments, it will summon the Hunter, who is an emaciated android torso with 6 articulated scything blades for limbs, and who will hunt you across the floor. This floor also features another way that you could possibly attack Monarch, because a lot of the power generation comes from here. So you can mess around with the power generators and start shutting down the station, but which will, of course, throw Monarch into a panic unless you do it in just the right way. The last couple pages, as I mentioned, are full of a D100 table of artifacts, which are just weird, freaky sci-fi objects that you can steal and use in really any game of this type. For example, you could find an Omni-Slick, which contains every single skill, which you can implant into your brain directly, burns out after use, but it makes you lose D100 sanity. Or possibly something like a library of templates, images and sounds, which are perfect carrier waves for mimetic warfare. Or maybe something like the Holy Book, a combination of all world religions into one coherent narrative, leads to an 80% universal conversion rate. Adherents are unknowingly mentally primed for AI domination. A lot of these things are worth huge amounts of money, so they are an incentive for players to dive into this thing, grab them, and then try and sell them on the open market. Though a lot of times after they sell them, the implications for what will happen to the galaxy are immense. So that's it for Gradient Descent. It really is a beautiful book. It's very dense, and for a game master that's willing to put a little bit of work into it, I think it would be a fantastic addition to any kind of sci-fi horror game. It's really remarkable. It's fairly easy to use for being so dense, and it has so many great ideas. I'll put links in the description below, as usual, for where you can check it out for yourself. Before we go, a quick shout out to some of our new patrons over on Patreon, including Wuggy, Mitchell Hodge, Sean, Trey Rumsey, Ryan Lewis Baron DeRop, Gottmaster Gray, Thomas Parker, David Lecoq, and Stevie Quill. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.